Hello, welcome back. This is Mistermath, your chess instructor. In this video, we'll be going over some beginner tactics. Tactics are probably best thought of as positional patterns, or patterns of setup of pieces that tend to give one side an advantage over another. In this video, we'll be going over some basic tactics that should be easy to memorize, and will also show up very often in your games and be very useful to understand and utilize. I'll mention before we start that, as you may have been able to tell, we've also changed our background as well as the general layout of the screen at some request of some friends. Let me know if you like it better, or if you think this layout is worse and why, and feel free to comment about what you would like to see as the setup if you have any requests for that. First, we'll be going over the puzzle from last video. As you may remember, this is a famous position from Steinitz versus von Bardeleben. In this position, if it's white to move, white has checkmate in 1. If it's black to move, black has checkmate in 1. And your objective was to find out which moves for each side would create that. Let's go over all of the possible moves for each side that could lead to checkmate and find out what the end result of the game was. So let's start with white. With white to move, let's see which pieces could give check first. None of the pawns would be capable of doing so, since they're too far from the king and can't move fast enough. Similarly, white's king is also too far. Note that it's literally impossible for a king to check another king, since they have the same movement range, and for a king to attack another king, they would have to move into striking distance of the other king. As a result, they cannot legally attack each other. Okay, now let's look at white's other pieces. The knight moves like a L as mentioned. Knight g5 wouldn't attack the king, here wouldn't attack the king, here wouldn't attack the king, here would not attack the king, here would not attack the king. But there is one place it can move to which would attack the king, and that is the e5 square. However, this is not checkmate for a multitude of reasons. First, black's king can still step backwards or forwards to get out of the check. And secondly, the knight is capturable by either black's pawn or by black's queen. Let's now look at white's rook. White's rook moves either horizontally or vertically. And so there are two moves which could deliver check. Rook to d1 might deliver check, but unfortunately there's a pawn in the way, so the only other move is rook to c7. However, since this rook is not protected, black can easily get out of the check by simply capturing the rook with either of his pieces. So the last piece to look at is white's queen. White's queen has three methods of attaining check. The first is to capture black's queen. However, black could just recapture, and so this is not checkmate. For similar reasons, queen e7 is also not checkmate. The queen and king would be able to capture the queen here, and therefore get out of check. The final check, however, is in fact the answer, and that's queen to d6. Queen d6 attacks the black king. The king cannot capture because the knight defends the queen, and of course, black is not permitted to make a move that would put their king in danger. The king also cannot escape, as the queen covers all of the escape squares. It might not be obvious why d8 is covered, but not only is it covered by a knight, but if the king steps back, the king can also capture it. And of course, the king is blocked by its own two pieces, and so cannot retreat diagonally and backwards. As a result, queen d6 is checkmate for white. Now let's look at all of black's pieces and all of black's moves, and see what black's one move checkmate would be. Again, the pawns and the king are all too far from white's king to create checkmate. Black's rook on a8 is also very trapped and doesn't have much movement at all, and of course cannot get close enough to the king. Black's queen can attack the king, although there's a wall of pawns in front of it. This first row is open, and so black could check white's king with queen to e1, which might appear to be checkmate, but of course, white's rook is capable of capturing on e1. Finally, there's the other rook on c8. Black's rook on c8 can do something very similar to black's queen on e8 and capture the rook on c1, and this is in fact checkmate. White has no legal moves, as the king cannot move forward, and the rook covers all of white's escape squares on the back rank. This is a common checkmating motif called a back rank mate, which we'll cover when we go over basic checkmates. Alright, so what was the actual result of this game? As it turned out, it was white to move in this game. Steinitz was the player playing white, von Barth-11 was the player playing black, and Steinitz made checkmate with the move queen to d6. Alright, now we'll get into the lesson. As mentioned previously, in this lesson we'll be going over some basic tactics, and we're going to start with pins, forks, and skewers. We'll begin with pins. A pin occurs when a piece attacks another piece, and behind the attacked piece is a big piece. Let's look at this position as an example. White's bishop is attacking black's knight. Of course, black would prefer the knight not to be taken, but if the knight were to move out of the way, then a bigger piece behind it would then be under attack, and white would be able to capture the black queen. As a result, this knight cannot move without losing heavy material, and therefore we call it a pinned piece. So again, a pin is a situation where you have a piece that moves in a straight line, it attacks a small piece, and the small piece is not able to move without fear of losing a bigger piece behind it. Of course, the bishop isn't the only piece that moves in a straight line. We can look at the queen. The queen also attacks the knight in this position. Behind that knight is a rook, and if the knight were to move, the rook would be able to be captured. As a result, the knight is pinned to the rook. And finally, we have the last type of pin with the rook. A rook is attacking a knight, and if the knight were to move, the king would be captured, and therefore, this is actually the strongest type of pin, as the knight, instead of technically being able to move in exchange for losing a piece, it's actually illegal to move the knight, since it would result in the king being under attack, and of course you're not allowed to make any move which puts your king in danger. A nice trick for remembering what a pin is imagining a sort of like a board with notes on the board. How do you keep a note on a board? Well, you can stick a pin in it, and when you stick a pin through a note into a board, what you're doing is you're pinning the small note, right? You can imagine in your head like a small, let's say like post-it note, pinning it and sticking through it to the big board behind it. And as a result, the small thing in front, in this case the knight, right, or the post-it note in our analogy, is unable to move, and there's a big thing behind it. So our king in this example, and the large board on the wall in our example. Our next type of tactic is called a fork. A fork is when a piece attacks two pieces at the same time. So unlike a pin where you're attacking one piece and there's a piece behind it, this time your piece directly attacks two other pieces at the same time. Note that unlike a pin, a fork can be done with any piece, and it does not require the piece to be able to move in a straight line. So what are some examples of this? Let's take a look at this position with white to move. In this position, white has three different forks. Let's start with the pawn. Here, white can move the pawn up 2 squares to the b4 square. Since it is starting on its starting square, it's able to move 2 squares at once, and as a result, it attacks both of black's knights. Of course, each player can only make one move at a time, so black would only be able to move one of the knights, and white would likely be able to capture the other knight on the next turn. The king is also capable of doing a fork. So for example, the king here can move to the d4 square, and in this situation, it attacks black's knight and pawn. And as it turns out, no matter what square the knight moves to, it can't defend the pawn, and white would be able to capture the pawn here. And finally, again, the most powerful type of fork is a fork that involves your opponent's largest pieces. So white's knight here can go to the g4 square, since it jumps like an L, attacking black's king and the queen, which is actually has a special name called a royal fork. And of course the king is attacked, and there's no way to block or capture the knight here, so it would have to move, and then the queen could be captured on the next turn. So an easy way to remember forks is that you can imagine an actual fork in real life, right? You can either imagine a fork in a road or a fork as in utensil, right? It's something that points in multiple directions at the same time. And so, for example, this knight is pointing at, is attacking or pointing at, in our analogy, both the king and the queen, and only one of them can move, the other will be captured. And the final tactic we'll be going over is called a skewer. A skewer is when, again, this one, like a pin, requires a piece that moves in a straight line, and this time, instead of a small piece being in front and a large piece being behind, it's reversed. So you have a big piece in front and small pieces behind. So you'll notice that this position is pretty similar to the one we had for a pin, except this time, instead of a knight, which is a relatively small piece being in front, we have the king in front. And no matter where the king moves, it's going to expose a small piece behind it for capture. So what would be an example? Let's look at the bishop. Bishop's attacking the king moves, and now once the king moves, there's a small piece behind it that can be captured. Similar story when looking at the queen. Queen attacks the king, if the king moves, queen's able to capture the bishop. And finally, in this position, white's rook is attacking the king moves, the rook is able to capture the knight. So these are all examples of skewers. And unlike a pin, where the piece in front is not able to move because it would expose a larger piece behind it to attack, a skewer is the opposite. The piece in front must move because it is the relatively big piece, and once the relatively big piece moves, then the smaller piece behind it gets captured for free. Now you can remember a skewer. This time there's no good real-life analogy, but you can simply remember a skewer instead as being the opposite of a pin. And that's the easy way to remember it. So once again, just a roundup of the three. You can think of a pin as sticking a pin on a note on a wall or on a board, where you have a pin going through a small thing and making sure that small thing cannot move because it's stuck to the big thing behind it. You can think of a fork as like a fork in a road, or a fork as a utensil, where one piece attacks multiple. And you can think of a skewer as just the opposite of a pin. Just remember, as the flip side, instead of small thing in front, big thing behind, it's big thing in front, small thing behind. Alright, now let's go over a puzzle to see if you remember some of the concepts that we learned. So we're going to start with an actual opening as our example here. This opening, as you can see from the puzzle name, is called the fried liver, a little bit of a whimsical name. And it begins with white moving the pawn to e4, black moves pawn to e5, white moves the knight to f3, black moves the knight to c6, white moves the bishop to c4, black moves the knight to f6, and now we have the trademark move of the fried liver, which is knight g5. With this move, white is preparing a threat and a capture, and my question is, what tactic is white threatening with this position on their next move? Pause the video if you need time to think, and unpause when you're ready. Alright, and hopefully you got the answer. White's looking to attack this f7 pawn with this move, knight to g5, as now they have two pieces attacking it and only one piece defending it. White could capture with the bishop on f7, but there's no tactic here. It's just a check on the king. There's no pin, fork, or skewer. What's really interesting, though, is what White's actually going for. Knight takes f7. And with knight takes f7, we now have the knight attacking the queen and the rook at the same time. And of course, this is a fork. Black would be, let's say, black made a move. They didn't notice this. Let's say they attempt to attack the knight with the move h6. Well, white can now respond with knight takes f7 and attack the queen and the rook. Black would, of course, prefer to move the queen since it's the bigger piece. And now white gets to gobble up the rook for free. Good job if you found that. Let's go on to the next part of the puzzle. Alright, we're back to this position, and we're going to use the continuation in this opening as the next part of our puzzle. A popular move for black to counter the fried liver is now the following variation. Black plays the move pawn to d5, blocking this bishop's attack on f7. White captures on d5. Now that the knight is attacked, black moves it to a5, counterattacking white's bishop. White goes bishop to b5 check, counterattacking black's king. And now there's pawn to c6 to block. White takes the pawn on c6, black recaptures b to c6, and attacks white's bishop. Now in this position, white's bishop is pinning the pawn to the king, but the pawn can still move because it's able to capture white's bishop. So it couldn't move to c5, but it's still able to capture the piece that is doing the pin. White has an option here to create a second pin and add further complication, and in doing so, stop their bishop from being captured for free. Can you find the pin that white is able to deliver here? Take your time, pause the video if necessary, and unpause when you're ready. Alright, and hopefully you found that to add a second pin on this pawn, we don't have that many options, and we have to pin the pawn in a diagonal other than this diagonal, right? Because the pawn's trying to move along this diagonal. So any other pin in any other direction would work. We can't create a pin here or here. None of our pieces can move in front of our pawns. And so we have this ruled out, this ruled out. Of course, the sideway pins, there's nothing to really pin. And of course, our only pin that we can make is going to be along this diagonal. So what piece can move to this diagonal? Well, the knight can, but the knight doesn't move in a line. Remember, the knight moves in an L shape, and so the knight can never make a pin. But the other piece that can move to this diagonal is going to be the queen. And of course, our answer is queen to f3. Getting on this diagonal and pinning the pawn to the rook. And as a result, black cannot play c takes b5 here, taking the bishop, because otherwise they would lose a rook, and white would be able to take this rook on a8. Good job if you found that. Alright, hopefully you now understand forks, pins, and skewers. And now we're going to move on to two other types of basic tactics, discoveries and x-rays. We're going to start with discoveries. Discoveries are a special type of move where a piece isn't initially able to move to another square, but once a piece that is in the way, once a piece that's blocking is moved out, then it is. So let's take a look at this example. Here with white to move, white has two options to create discoveries. As with both discoveries and x-rays can be split into attacking and defending versions. Let's start with the discovery that's an attack, also known as a discovered attack. Here, white's rook would be able to capture the knight on e7 if the king were to move. So white can move the king. King goes to, let's say, d4, and now the rook is able to attack the knight on e7. This is known as a discovered attack. The rook didn't move to any new spots to attack the knight, but rather something that was in the way moved out of the way, and now white's rook is able to capture on e7 on the next move, and black must respond to this threat. Discovered attacks tend to be most useful when the piece that is moving out of the way also does something. So for example, white's king could go to f4 here, creating the same discovered attack, and in addition, the king also now attacks the pawn on g4. Black can only defend one, of course, and the other would fall. So let's say the knight moves to c6 here, and the king can capture on g4. But wait, you might have noticed that white's knight is under attack in all of this discussion. And of course, the discovered attack isn't very useful when your opponent can just take one of your pieces. So we're going to now go over the other type of discovery, which is a discovered defense. Here, again, white's rook would be able to defend the knight on a2. However, there's a pawn in the way. So, to defend the knight, all we have to do is move the pawn up, let's say, one square or two squares, either way is fine. And now, white's rook also covers the knight on a2, and now they can also go for the discovered attack on the next turn. Finally, we'll be going over x-rays. X-rays are a tactic that can be very similar to a skewer or a discovered attack, and so it can be confusing, but it's simple when you see some examples of it. In an X-ray, a piece that moves in a straight line defends another piece that it isn't originally defending in the original position, but will defend it after that piece is taken. What does that mean? Let's look at this position as an example. in this case, with white to move, white's queen is currently under attack. White would love to checkmate the black king by moving the queen to either e8 or d8. However, if it goes to d8, it appears that it can be captured by the bishop, and if it goes to e8, it appears that it can be captured by the rook. However, white's rook in this case x-rays its own queen. As a result, with white to move in this position, white actually does have a checkmate pattern, and that is the move queen to e8. You might say, wait, white's rook doesn't protect its own queen, it's blocked by the black rook. But notice that the piece capturing the queen is the same piece that's blocking. And so when black makes the move, rook takes e8, white in fact can respond with the move rook takes e8 himself to capture black's rook and deliver checkmate. Let's go back and look at it one more time. In this position, white can make the move queen to e8. It doesn't look like white's rook is defending, but it actually is defending its own queen via an x-ray. And so when black's rook attempts to capture the white queen, white's rook is capable of recapturing. Notice the differences between this, a skewer, and the discovered attack. In fact, the Wikipedia, if you look up the Wikipedia for an x-ray, Wikipedia actually also lists incorrect examples of an x-ray as a discovered attack or as a skewer. Like a skewer, your opponent's piece moves, and that allows you to go ahead and capture after it. However, unlike a skewer, you're recapturing your own piece that was captured, and the opponent's piece isn't moving to the side, it's moving to capture your piece. Unlike a discovered attack, the order of the pieces is switched. So if, for example, it was flipped, so let's say the queen was here, the rook was here, if the queen moved to the side, this would be a discovered attack. But this order of the pieces is swapped. It's your piece that's behind an opposing piece. So those are the differences between an x-ray and a skewer. An x-ray, of course, can be used both offensively and defensively. Let's say this was the position, and it was black to move instead. Let's ignore that black can capture the queen on e7. Let's focus on white's rook on e2. Previously, white was using it offensively, but here, with black to move, white can use it defensively. White's queen doesn't defend the rook on e2 directly, but via an x-ray, it does. So, in this case, white does an x-ray defense of his own rook, and after the rook is captured with rook takes e2, white can respond with queen takes e2. Again, it doesn't look like white's queen is defending the rook, but because the piece capturing the rook is the same piece blocking the way, white actually is able to defend this rook with the queen. So, similar to a discovered attack, an x-ray can be used both offensively and defensively. An offensive x-ray attack, like this, or a defensive x-ray, like this. Alright, now let's go over another puzzle. Again, it's going to be from an opening, so this is a real application, starting with d4, e5. This is called the England Gambit. White may now capture the pawn on e5. Black goes queen e7 to attack it. Knight f3, knight c6, apply some more pressure on it. White's main method of defense now is bishop to f4. Black now responds with the main point of this gambit, which is queen to b4 check, with a triple fork. White opts to save two of the three things by moving the bishop back to d2. And now there's queen takes b2, attacking the rook. It appears that white is going to lose the rook. After all, the rook is attacked, there's nothing defending it, and the rook is completely incapable of moving. However, white actually has two ways of defending the rook here. One is a discovered defense, the other is an x-ray defense. Can you find out the two ways? Pause the video if you need to, take your time, and unpause when you're ready. Alright, white has two ways to defend this rook here. Let's focus on the discovered defense first. White's queen would love to defend this rook, but there's a knight in the way. So which square should we move the knight to? Well, there's knight to a3, but this knight is now vulnerable to capture by black's queen. So, instead, we move the knight to c3, because here it's defended by the bishop. And now, as you can see, white's queen is able to defend white's rook, and white doesn't lose more than the pawn on b2. But white has another way of defending the rook here. Instead of using a discovered defense, white could have also used an X-ray defense. But of course, recall that an X-ray is not with 3 of your own pieces lined up, but rather goes your piece, then your opponent's piece, then your piece again. We have part of that lined up here with the queen and the rook. So now we need to place our piece somewhere along this diagonal to create an X-ray. And the only piece that can move in a straight line that we can place there is the bishop. And in fact, that is the correct move. Bishop takes c3 creates an X-ray defense. For if now black plays queen takes a1, capturing the rook, we can capture back with the bishop because the bishop was defending the rook via an X-ray. Again, although it might look tricky and looks like the bishop is not defending the rook, in fact it is, because the piece that is capturing the rook is the same piece that seems to be blocking in the way. Alright, good job if you found those 2 moves. But now, black has their own tactic to turn the situation around in their favor. White just used the tactic of an X-ray defense to defend their rook. However, now with you playing black, black has their own tactic that will allow them to actually still win material or potentially the game. Can you find what black's tactic is? Hint, it's a pin. Take your time, pause the video if you need to, and unpause when you're ready. Alright, and hopefully you found the pin in this position. Black could move the queen to b4 and create a pin this way, but that wouldn't be a very effective pin because white would just capture the queen. Instead though, black can use one of the pieces they have not yet developed, and that is the bishop on f8. Black can play bishop f8 to b4, and that creates a pin on the white bishop towards their king. And now the threat is renewed. This bishop cannot X-ray defend the rook because they cannot move to the a1 square as their king would be under attack. This is actually a famous line in the England Gambit. That's spelled, by the way, with a U and not an A. But this is a famous line in the England Gambit because white can now mess up very badly here by attempting to continue to use tactics. White could play queen d2, defending this bishop. Bishop takes c3, sorry. If white were to capture with the knight, they would lose their rook, so they can use another X-ray defense on their rook with queen takes c3. But now, instead of capturing the rook, black actually has queen to c1, and that's actually checkmate. The king's got nowhere to go, not on d1, not on d2, and of course it can't escape to the right because it's blocked by its own pieces. So good job if you found that. This is a very famous trap in the England Gambit. Let's move on to the final puzzle. Alright, here's our final puzzle for the video. As usual, this is going to be a challenge puzzle, the solution to which we'll go over in the next video. This position is a very well-known endgame study. White has their rook in front of their pawn. Black has the rook behind their opponent's pawn. And the pawn is 1 square away from queening. However, this has been studied very thoroughly, and it's well known to be a draw. White cannot win because of the following reasons. Firstly, white cannot move the rook out, because if the rook were to move, let's say to c8, then black would simply just capture the pawn on a7. Checking the king with the move also doesn't work. Let's say you try to play king g8 to force black. Well, black can't capture the pawn now, right? They must capture the rook, and now you can promote. Well, you have the same problem. Once you do promote, the rook can still capture on a8. Going back to the original position, you might also think, well, can white's king chase black's rook off of the a file? And the answer to that is also no. So let's say white got infinite time, got to move the king over to b2. Well, black could just slide the rook up to a6. And once the king goes up to b5 to attack it, well, now the rook just slides back to a1. Okay, but maybe white can defend the pawn, right? If white defends the pawn and then moves the rook out, maybe white can now make a queen because black can't capture the pawn. Except no, the moment white goes to touch the pawn, black can go ahead and offer white check, and you'll notice the board is completely open. There's no place for white to hide. And so White is just going to keep getting checked, check, 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 check. White cannot make progress in this position. So this position is a theoretically very well-known draw if played correctly by both sides. However, and here's the interesting part, this position is not a draw. This position is won for white if white is to move in this position. In the winning method, uses one of the 5 tactics we learned. So remember, the 5 tactics are pins, forks, skewers, discovered attacks, and X-rays. One of those tactics here is used to get white to win the game. Can you figure out what the difference is between this position and the previous position I told you was a draw? Pause the video, or rather don't pause the video since that's the end of the video, but also feel free to pause the video if you need to. Good luck with the puzzle, and I'll see you all next week.